Welcome to Shattered Sky Stories. Remember to hit the like button and the subscribe button so you don't miss any sci-fi stories. Now sit back and enjoy. The morning alarm chimed through the sterile corridors of Station Prometheus with its usual mechanical precision. Sergeant Nash Ryder rolled from his narrow bunk, his feet finding the cold metal floor in the practiced motion of someone who had performed this routine for 8 years. The artificial gravity hummed beneath his boots as he dressed in the regulation gray uniform that marked him as one of humanity's finest. A soldier in service to the Galactic Alliance, protector of the peace between species, guardian of the cosmic order. Nash had earned 17 commendations, survived 4 major engagements against the hostile forces that threatened civilized space, and never once questioned why humanity had been chosen for this honor. The patrons, in their infinite wisdom, had lifted mankind from their primitive world 3 centuries ago, gifting them with technology, purpose, and a place among the stars. What more could anyone ask for? He walked through the corridors lined with propaganda displays showing humanity's integration into the Alliance. Images of human soldiers standing proudly alongside the tall, luminous forms of their patron overseers rotated on the screens. The patrons appeared as beings of pure light, their bodies humanoid but somehow more perfect, radiating benevolence and wisdom. Text scrolled beneath, united in purpose, guided by light, serving the greater good. The mess hall buzzed with quiet conversation. Nash took his assigned seat at table 7, nodding to the familiar faces of his squad. Private Chin was picking at her protein paste, while Corporal Martinez reviewed tactical reports on his tablet. Their upcoming deployment to the Helix Nebula had everyone on edge. Intelligence suggested significant enemy activity in that sector. Another glorious day in paradise, Chin muttered, earning a sharp look from Martinez. Watch it, Chin. You know the walls have ears. Nash remained silent, focusing on his meal. He'd learned long ago that idle complaints led to psychological evaluations, and psychological evaluations led to reassignment. A euphemism that made veteran soldiers go quiet and pale. No one talked about what happened to the reassigned. The conversation died as Captain Voss entered the mess hall. Her stride was crisp, her expression unreadable, but Nash noticed something different about her today. Her usually perfect composure seemed strained, and when she spoke, her voice carried an unusual tension. Squad 7, you're wanted in Bay 9. Immediate deployment orders. Nash and his team exchanged glances. Immediate deployments meant something had gone wrong, badly wrong. They abandoned their meals and followed Voss through the station's maze of corridors. As they walked, Nash noticed increased security presence. More guards at checkpoints, additional patrols, and a subtle change in the air recycling system that suggested the station had moved to heightened alert status. Bay 9 housed one of the station's patron liaison chambers, a pristine white room where humanity's overseers communicated directly with their human subordinates. Nash had only been in the presence of a patron 3 times in his career, and each experience had left him with a sense of profound awe and inadequacy. But when they entered the chamber, something was wrong. The patron who stood waiting for them, Luminar Vex, according to the golden nameplate that materialized in the air beside its form, was flickering. Its usually perfect humanoid outline wavered like a broken hologram, and occasionally Nash caught glimpses of something else beneath the light. Something with too many angles, surfaces that seemed to bend inward on themselves, and what might have been clusters of eyes arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Faithful servants, Vex spoke, its voice the usual melodic harmony that patron communication took. You are required for an urgent mission in the Kepler system. Enemy forces have breached our defensive perimeter and taken Alliance personnel hostage. The light around Vex pulsed, and Nash felt the familiar warm sensation of psychic reassurance that always accompanied patron presence. But today, underneath that warmth, something cold seemed to writhe. The sensation made his skin crawl, though he couldn't understand why. The enemy has violated the most sacred protocols of war, Vex continued, its form stabilizing somewhat. They have targeted civilians, including patron advisors. This cannot be tolerated. Captain Voss stepped forward. What are our rules of engagement, Luminar? The flickering returned, more pronounced now. For a split second, Nash saw what looked like writhing tentacles beneath the projected light, and heard something that wasn't quite speech, more like the sound of metal scraping against glass, or screaming from very far away. Terminate all enemy forces. Take no prisoners. Retrieve the hostages by any means necessary. The cold sensation intensified. Nash felt a pressure building behind his eyes, and he had the strangest urge to run. But that was impossible. The patrons were humanity's saviors, their wisest allies. These feelings were just pre-mission jitters, nothing more. You will be accompanied by enforcement units and provided with enhanced weaponry. Time is of critical importance. Vex's form solidified again, though Nash thought he could still see movement in its depths, like something swimming in dark water. Prepare for immediate launch. May your service honor the Alliance. As they filed out of the chamber, Nash caught Corporal Martinez's eye. His teammate's face was pale, and he kept glancing back at the door they'd just passed through. Chen was unusually quiet, her usual pre-mission jokes notably absent. They were halfway to the armory when the alarms began. Not the standard deployment alert, but the harsh, urgent wail that meant station emergency. Red lights bathed the corridors as automated voices echoed through the halls. All personnel to emergency stations. Security breach in Sector 7. Quarantine protocols now in effect. Captain Voss's communication device crackled to life. Captain, this is Control. Your deployment is postponed. Report to Security Chief Hammond immediately. Voss acknowledged the order, but Nash could see the confusion in her expression. In 8 years of service, he'd never seen a deployment postponed for any reason. The Alliance's military operated on schedules that were considered almost sacred, planned by patron strategists whose calculations accounted for countless variables across space and time. Security Chief Hammond met them at the entrance to Sector 7. The man's face was grim, his usual bureaucratic pleasantness replaced by something that looked almost like fear. There's been an incident, he said without preamble. During routine maintenance on the deep storage levels, a team discovered an unauthorized access to the historical archives. Someone has been digging through classified material. Nash felt that cold sensation return. The historical archives contained records from humanity's first contact with the patrons, documents that were strictly regulated and available only to the highest clearance levels. Unauthorized access was considered not just a crime, but a form of heresy. The intruder triggered a defensive protocol, Hammond continued. We found the maintenance team. Well, we found what was left of them. He led them through a series of security checkpoints, each one requiring additional authorization scans. Nash noticed that the guards at each station seemed nervous, avoiding eye contact and speaking in whispers. The deeper they went into the station, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. Sector 7's deep storage levels were a maze of corridors lined with sealed vaults containing everything from technological schematics to cultural artifacts from humanity's pre-patron era. The air here always felt stale, heavy with the weight of hidden history. They found the maintenance team in Archive Room 47C. Nash had seen death before, had watched comrades fall in battle against the Alliance's enemies. But this was different. The 3 technicians hadn't just been killed, they had been torn apart from the inside out, their bodies arranged in a pattern that seemed to pulse with meaning just beyond comprehension. Their faces were frozen in expressions of absolute terror, eyes wide and mouths open as if they had been screaming at the moment of death. But worse than the bodies was what surrounded them. The archive room's walls were covered in symbols carved deep into the metal, symbols that seemed to move when Nash wasn't looking directly at them. The carvings were still warm to the touch, and they emanated a sound just below the threshold of hearing, a thrumming that made his teeth ache and his vision blur. What could have done this? Chin whispered, her voice barely audible. Hammond shook his head. According to the access logs, the room was sealed until this morning. The maintenance team came in for routine data verification and found. He gestured helplessly at the carnage. The unauthorized access had triggered some kind of defense system. The files that were accessed contained records from the early days of the Alliance, specifically concerning the nature of our enemies in the outer spiral. Nash stepped closer to examine the symbols on the walls. As he did, the thrumming sound grew louder, and he began to make out what might have been words, though in no language he recognized. The cold sensation spread through his entire body, and for a moment he experienced a vivid flash of imagery that didn't belong to him. Vast shapes moving through space, things that weren't quite ships but weren't quite alive, and a sense of being watched by intelligences so alien that human minds could barely process their existence. "Sergeant Ryder," Hammond said sharply. "Step away from the wall." Nash jerked back, realizing he had been pressing his hand against one of the symbols. His palm was warm and he could feel something like an electric current running up his arm. But as he pulled away, he heard something that chilled him to the bone. In the thrumming sound, just for an instant, he heard words in perfect, clear English. "They are not what they seem. They are not your friends. They hunger." "We need to evacuate this room immediately," Hammond ordered. "This area is being sealed pending investigation by patron authority." As they filed out, Nash glanced back one final time. The symbols seemed brighter now, pulsing with a rhythm that reminded him of a heartbeat. And in that pulsing, he thought he saw the outline of something that looked very much like the shape he'd glimpsed beneath Luminarvec's failing projection. The security lockdown that followed was swift and comprehensive. Within hours, Sector 7 was completely sealed, the maintenance team's bodies removed by special patron enforcement units, and all personnel who had been in the area were subjected to intensive questioning. Nash and his squad spent 6 hours in individual interrogation rooms, answering the same questions repeatedly. "What did you see? What did you hear? Did you experience any unusual sensations or thoughts?" Nash answered truthfully about the physical evidence, the bodies, the symbols, the strange sounds. But he said nothing about the voice he'd heard, or the images that had flashed through his mind when he touched the wall. Some instinct warned him that revealing those details would lead to consequences he couldn't imagine. When the questioning was finally over, he was released with strict orders not to discuss the incident with anyone and to report any unusual dreams or thoughts to medical immediately. Captain Voss informed the squad that their deployment had been permanently canceled and they were being reassigned to routine patrol duties within the station. That night, Nash lay in his bunk staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The voice he'd heard kept echoing in his mind. "They are not what they seem. They are not your friends. They hunger." He thought about Luminarvec's flickering form, the glimpses of something alien and wrong beneath the beautiful projection. He thought about the symbols that had seemed to move on their own, and the maintenance team's expressions of absolute terror. Most troubling of all, he thought about the swift and decisive way the incident had been contained, the way questions had been asked not to understand what happened, but to determine how much each witness had seen and comprehended. For the first time in his 8 years of faithful service, Sergeant Nash Ryder began to wonder if the alliance he served so loyally might be keeping secrets that were too terrible for humanity to know. The next morning brought new orders. Nash and his entire squad were being transferred to a special assignment in the Outer Rim, effective immediately. Captain Voss delivered the news with the same strained expression she'd worn the day before, and Nash noticed she wouldn't quite meet his eyes. "It's an honor," she said, though her voice carried no conviction. "You'll be working directly with patron oversight, providing security for deep space research installations." Nash knew what this really meant. They had seen too much, asked too many questions, or simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The Outer Rim was where inconvenient soldiers were sent to disappear quietly, far from the core worlds where their absence might be noticed. But as he packed his few possessions, Nash made a decision that would change everything. Hidden in the lining of his duty jacket was a small recording device, standard issue for mission documentation. On it, he had captured 3 minutes of audio from Archive Room 47C, 3 minutes that contained the thrumming sound and, buried within it, the voice that had spoken in English. He was going to find out what the Alliance was hiding, even if it killed him. And in the deepest vaults of Station Prometheus, where the historical archives stretched back to humanity's first contact with their supposed saviors, sealed records waited in the darkness. Records that told a very different story about the patron's true nature, and the real reason humanity had been chosen to serve in their eternal war. Records that explained why the maintenance team had died screaming, and why the symbols on the walls pulsed with alien hunger. Records that revealed the horrifying truth about what the Alliance was really fighting, and what they had become in the process. The transport to Kepler Station took 18 days through hyperspace, 18 days during which Nash had time to think, to remember, and to question everything he thought he knew about his life and service to the Alliance. The other members of his squad, Chin, Martinez, and 3 replacement soldiers he'd never met, seemed subdued during the journey, speaking in whispers when they spoke at all. Kepler Station orbited a dying star in the Outer Rim, its massive bulk silhouetted against the red giant's fading light. The station served as a research facility and forward observation post, monitoring the deep space regions where the Alliance's mysterious enemies were said to operate. Nash had heard stories about the Outer Rim stations. Isolation drove men mad, equipment failed mysteriously, and personnel turnover was unusually high. Their new commanding officer, Major Sarah Park, met them at the docking bay. She was younger than Nash had expected, probably no more than 35, but her eyes held the haunted look of someone who had seen too much. "Welcome to the edge of nowhere," she said without humor. "I'll be frank with you, this isn't a reward posting. You're here because someone wants you far away from the core systems. The question is whether you're going to cause trouble or keep your heads down." Nash studied her face carefully. There was something in her expression, a guarded intelligence that suggested she knew more than she was saying. "We're here to serve, Major," he replied carefully. "Good. Because serving out here means following orders without questions, no matter how strange they might seem." She paused, looking directly at Nash. "I understand you had an incident at Prometheus Station. Archive access, classified materials, that sort of thing?" The way she said it made Nash's skin crawl. She wasn't asking for information, she already had it. "There was an accident in the storage levels," Nash said neutrally. "Maintenance team found some kind of security breach." "Yes, I'm sure that's what the reports say." Park's smile was thin and cold. "Well, Sergeant, you'll find that accidents happen frequently out here. Equipment malfunctions, personnel go missing, sometimes entire research teams simply disappear. The official explanation is usually enemy action or technical failure." She led them through corridors that were noticeably different from those on Prometheus Station. The walls here were older, built from a different alloy that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Strange geometric patterns were etched into the metal at regular intervals. Not decorative elements, but something that looked almost like protective wards. "Your primary duty will be security patrol of the research levels," Park continued. "We have 17 active projects studying various aspects of our ongoing conflict with hostile forces. Some of these projects require enhanced security protocols." They passed a sealed door marked with symbols Nash had never seen before. As they walked by, he heard a sound from within, something that might have been machinery but had an organic quality that made his stomach turn. "Major," Martinez spoke up, "what kind of research is being conducted here?" Park stopped walking. "The kind that keeps humanity alive in a universe full of things that want to destroy us. The kind that requires soldiers who understand that some secrets are kept secret for very good reasons." They reached the security station, a fortified checkpoint overlooking the main research levels. Through the reinforced windows, Nash could see laboratories and containment facilities stretching into the distance. Scientists in environmental suits moved between the various installations, their movements careful and deliberate. "Your shifts will be 12 hours on, 12 hours off," Park explained. "You'll work in pairs, never alone. If you see anything unusual during your patrols, and I mean anything, you report it immediately to myself or the duty officer. Do not investigate on your own. Do not discuss what you see with other personnel. Do not make recordings of any kind." The last instruction hit Nash like a physical blow. The recording device hidden in his jacket suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. "Are there specific threats we should be aware of?" Chin asked. Park's expression darkened. "Sergeant Chin, in your time at Prometheus Station, did you ever wonder why humans are the Alliance's primary military force? Why we're the ones sent to fight and die in this eternal war?" "The patrons chose us because of our potential," Chin replied, reciting standard Alliance doctrine. "Our adaptability and courage make us ideal partners in defending civilized space. That's what they tell us." Park's voice carried a bitter edge. "And maybe some of it's even true. But the real reason is simpler. We're expendable. Humans breed fast, mature quickly, and die without much fuss. Perfect soldiers for a war that consumes entire civilizations." The casual way she spoke about human expendability shocked Nash. This was the kind of talk that led to immediate reassignment, the kind of heretical thinking that the Alliance's psychological monitors were trained to detect and eliminate. But Park wasn't finished. "The research conducted here is focused on understanding our enemies, their capabilities, their weaknesses, their true nature. Some of what we've learned." She paused, staring out at the laboratories below. "Some of what we've learned suggests that the war we're fighting isn't what we've been told it is." Over the following days, Nash settled into the routine of patrol duty, but nothing about Kepler Station felt normal. The research levels were a maze of interconnected laboratories, each one sealed behind multiple airlock systems and protected by security protocols that seemed excessive for scientific work. The scientists barely acknowledged the security patrols, going about their business with the single-minded focus of people who had seen things that haunted their sleep. It was during his third week on station that Nash first encountered Dr. Elena Vasquez. She was working late in Laboratory 17, a restricted access facility that required special authorization to enter. Nash was conducting his evening patrol when he noticed the lab's security door was slightly ajar, a serious violation of protocol. He approached carefully, hand resting on his sidearm. Through the gap in the door, he could see Dr. Vasquez hunched over a workstation, studying something on multiple screens. But what caught his attention was the sound, that same low thrumming he had heard in the archive room on Prometheus Station. "Dr. Vasquez," he called out, pushing the door open. "The laboratory is supposed to be secured during off hours." She spun around, her face pale and strained. "Sergeant Ryder, I didn't hear you approach. I was just finishing some calculations." Nash looked past her to the screens. They showed what appeared to be star charts, but the configurations were wrong. The patterns didn't match any stellar geography he was familiar with, and some of the objects marked on the charts seemed to be moving in ways that defied physical laws. "What kind of calculations?" he asked, stepping closer. Dr. Vasquez quickly shut down the displays. "Orbital mechanics. Quite boring, really." But her hands were shaking as she powered down the workstation. "I should probably get some rest. Long day tomorrow." As she gathered her materials, Nash noticed something that made his blood run cold. Among the papers on her desk was a printout showing the same symbols he had seen carved into the walls of Archive Room 47C. The symbols that had pulsed with alien life, that had spoken to him in that impossible voice. "Doctor," he said carefully, "where did these symbols come from?" She followed his gaze to the printout, and her face went even paler. "Those are archaeological finds. Ancient inscriptions discovered on uninhabited worlds in the outer spiral." "What do they mean?" Dr. Vasquez looked around nervously, as if afraid they were being watched. Then she leaned closer and whispered, "They're warnings, Sergeant. Warnings about something that's been hunting civilized species for millions of years. Something that uses other species as weapons against their enemies." The thrumming sound grew louder, and Nash realized it wasn't coming from the laboratory equipment. It was coming from somewhere deep within the station itself, a resonance that seemed to travel through the metal walls and into his bones. "I have to go," Dr. Vasquez said abruptly. This conversation never happened. But as she hurried toward the exit, she pressed something into Nash's hand, a small data chip that felt warm to the touch. "If something happens to me," she whispered, "find the truth. Humanity deserves to know what we're really fighting for." That night, Nash waited until his roommate was asleep before accessing the data chip on his personal terminal. What he found there changed everything he thought he knew about the Alliance, the war, and humanity's place in the galaxy. The files contained research data spanning decades, compiled from archaeological sites, intercepted enemy communications, and careful analysis of patron technology. Dr. Vasquez and her team had been conducting unauthorized research into the true nature of the galactic conflict, and what they had discovered was horrifying. The war wasn't between the Alliance and some mysterious hostile force. The war was between two factions of the same species, ancient entities that existed partially outside normal space-time, feeding on the psychic energy generated by fear, pain, and death. The patrons weren't humanity's benevolent uplifters. They were predators who had discovered that certain species could be molded into effective weapons against their eternal enemies. Humanity hadn't been chosen for their courage or adaptability. They had been chosen because human minds were particularly susceptible to psychic manipulation, because human emotions generated the specific type of energy the patrons needed to power their weapons, and because humans bred quickly enough to provide a steady supply of expendable soldiers. The enemy forces that Alliance troops fought weren't trying to destroy civilized space. They were trying to free the various species from their patron overlords. But the psychic conditioning that all Alliance personnel underwent made it impossible for them to recognize this truth. The enemy appeared as monstrous threats because the patrons projected that image directly into human minds. Nash stared at the screen, his hands shaking. Everything he had believed, everything he had fought for, everything that gave his life meaning, all of it was a lie. He and every other human soldier were nothing more than livestock, bred and conditioned to serve as psychic batteries and expendable troops in a war they didn't understand. But the worst revelation was yet to come. According to the research data, the patrons were losing their ancient war. Their enemies were growing stronger, developing countermeasures to the psychic manipulation that kept species like humanity enslaved. In desperation, the patrons were preparing a final gambit, a massive psychic assault that would draw power from every human mind in Alliance space simultaneously. The assault would destroy human consciousness as a species, reducing billions of people to empty shells while channeling their psychic energy into one last desperate attack. And according to the timeline in the files, the assault was scheduled to begin within days. Nash copied the data to his own storage device and deleted the files from his terminal. He had to find Dr. Vasquez, had to learn more about what her team had discovered and whether there was any way to stop what was coming. But when he arrived at Laboratory 17 the next morning, he found Major Park waiting for him with a security detail. "Sergeant Ryder," she said formally, "you're being reassigned. There's been an incident." Behind her, Nash could see through the open laboratory door. Dr. Vasquez was gone, and the laboratory had been completely sterilized. No equipment, no research materials, no evidence that anyone had ever worked there. "What kind of incident?" Nash asked, though he already knew the answer. "Dr. Vasquez suffered a psychological breakdown," Park replied. "She was found in her quarters this morning, completely catatonic. She's been removed for medical evaluation." Nash knew he would never see Dr. Vasquez again. The Alliance had ways of dealing with personnel who learned too much, and those ways didn't involve medical treatment. "Your new assignment is in the Deep Monitoring Station," Park continued. "Enhanced security duty. You'll be working directly with patron oversight." As the security detail escorted him through the station's corridors, Nash realized he was walking toward whatever fate awaited soldiers who had outlived their usefulness. But he still carried Dr. Vasquez's research data, still held proof of the horrifying truth about humanity's place in the galaxy. And somewhere in the Deep Monitoring Station, he would find his chance to act on that knowledge, even if it meant facing the true form of the creatures that had been masquerading as humanity's saviors for 3 centuries. The monitoring station occupied the lowest levels of Kepler Station, buried deep within the asteroid on which the facility was built. The corridors here were older than anything Nash had seen, carved from living rock and lined with symbols that hurt to look at directly. The air was thick and oppressive, carrying a metallic taste that coated the back of his throat. His new duty station overlooked a massive chamber filled with incomprehensible machinery. Crystalline structures pulsed with inner light, connected by flowing conduits that seemed to carry liquid energy rather than any conventional power source. The entire assembly thrummed with that same low-frequency sound he had encountered in the archives, but here it was amplified 1,000-fold. "Impressive, isn't it?" Nash turned to find Luminar Vex approaching, its projected form more stable than it had been on Prometheus Station but still carrying that wrongness he had noticed before. This close to the alien machinery, the projection seemed less convincing, its edges blurring and revealing glimpses of something that definitely wasn't humanoid. "What is this place?" Nash asked, fighting to keep his voice steady. "This is where we monitor the progress of the war," Vex replied, its harmonious voice carrying an undertone that sounded like grinding metal. "From here we can observe the movements of our enemies throughout the galaxy and coordinate our response." The patron gestured toward the machinery, and Nash saw that some of the crystalline structures contained what looked like organic matter. Tissue samples, neural networks, possibly even intact brains floating in preservative fluid. "Your species has such interesting neurological patterns," Vex continued conversationally. "So much more complex than most of the races we've worked with. The emotional resonance alone is quite remarkable." Nash felt a chill run down his spine. The organic matter in the crystals, it was human. He was looking at human brains being used as components in an alien machine. "The monitoring process requires living neural tissue to interpret the psychic emanations of enemy forces," Vex explained, as if commenting on the weather. "Voluntary donations from your species have been adequate for our needs." "Voluntary?" Nash managed to say. Vex's projection flickered, and for a moment Nash saw something that might have been amusement in the writhing mass of alien flesh beneath the light. "Oh yes, every human who enters our service volunteers, Sergeant Ryder. They volunteer to fight, to die, to serve in whatever capacity we require. The psychic conditioning ensures complete cooperation. The truth hit Nash like a physical blow. Every human in the Alliance was psychically enslaved, their free will subsumed by alien manipulation. They thought they were making choices, but those choices were being made for them by creatures that saw them as nothing more than useful tools. You seem disturbed, Vex observed. Are you experiencing psychological difficulties? We can arrange for adjustment procedures if necessary. Nash forced himself to remain calm. No, sir. I'm fine. Excellent. Then you can begin your duties immediately. Vex gestured toward a control station overlooking the machinery. Your task is to monitor the neural activity of our organic components and report any anomalies. As Nash took his position at the control station, he realized he was being given access to the very heart of the patron operation on Kepler Station. The displays showed real-time data from thousands of human minds throughout Alliance space, their thoughts and emotions being harvested and processed by the alien machinery. And according to the readings, something was building. The neural activity patterns were shifting, aligning in ways that suggested massive preparation for some kind of psychic event. The final assault that Dr. Vasquez had warned about was beginning. But hidden in his jacket, Nash still carried the recording device from Prometheus Station and the data chip containing Dr. Vasquez's research. Somewhere in this horrifying machine, there had to be a way to expose the truth, to break the psychic conditioning that kept humanity enslaved. He had found the enemy's stronghold. Now he had to find a way to strike back before it was too late. As he studied the alien machinery, Nash began to understand that the war he had fought in wasn't ending, it was about to begin in earnest. And this time humanity would be fighting for their very souls. Nash spent 3 days learning the monitoring systems before he found his opportunity. The alien machinery operated on cycles that corresponded to the sleep patterns of human populations throughout Alliance space, harvesting psychic energy when billions of minds were most vulnerable during dream states. During these cycles, the security presence in the deep monitoring station was reduced, leaving Nash alone with the horrifying truth of humanity's enslavement. On the third night, as the massive crystalline structures pulsed with stolen human consciousness, Nash made his move. He had identified the station's primary communication array, a nexus point where all Alliance military channels converged before being transmitted to fleet commanders throughout the galaxy. If he could access that system and broadcast Dr. Vasquez's research data, every human soldier in Alliance space would learn the truth simultaneously. But first, he had to disable the psychic dampening field that kept the monitoring station isolated from the rest of Kepler Station. The field prevented unauthorized communications and, more importantly, kept the screams of the harvested minds from reaching the human personnel above. Nash approached one of the larger crystalline structures, its surface pulsing with veins of organic light. Inside, he could see the preserved brain of what had once been a human being, its neural pathways now integrated into the alien machine. The sight filled him with a rage so pure and intense that for a moment the psychic conditioning that had controlled his thoughts for 8 years began to crack. He pressed his hand against the crystal, and immediately felt the mental anguish of the consciousness trapped within. Images flooded his mind, memories of a life stolen, a family forgotten, a soul consumed by alien hunger. But underneath the pain, Nash sensed something else, a desperate desire to be free, to warn others, to fight back against the creatures that had destroyed everything human about their existence. Using the knowledge he had gained from Dr. Vasquez's research, Nash began to systematically overload the neural interfaces that connected the human brains to the alien machinery. One by one, he severed the psychic links, and each disconnection sent a shockwave through the monitoring station systems. Alarms began to sound as the carefully calibrated machine started to malfunction. The crystalline structures flickered and dimmed, their organic components finally free to die as nature intended. But their sacrifice was not in vain. Each disconnected brain sent out a final psychic pulse, a wordless scream that pierced the dampening field and reached every human mind on Kepler Station. Nash felt the moment when the conditioning began to break. Throughout the station, human personnel suddenly remembered suppressed thoughts, questioned orders they had never thought to question before, and experienced the first moments of genuine free will they had known in years. The response was immediate and violent. Security forces loyal to the patrons moved to contain what their alien masters classified as a psychic contamination event. Nash could hear boots pounding through the corridors above as enforcement teams rushed to the monitoring station. He reached the communication console just as the first security forces arrived. As laser fire erupted around him, Nash uploaded Dr. Vasquez's research data to every active communication channel in the Alliance network. The files spread like wildfire, each transmission automatically replicating itself and broadcasting to thousands of recipients. Across Alliance space, human soldiers and civilians received the data burst and experienced their first moments of clarity in 3 centuries. The psychological conditioning that had made them willing slaves began to crumble as they learned the truth about their supposed saviors. Stop. The voice that commanded him was not human. Luminar Vex materialized in the monitoring station, but its projection was no longer stable. The massive psychic disruption Nash had caused was interfering with the patron's ability to maintain its deceptive appearance. What stood before him now was the true form of humanity's oppressor, a writhing mass of what might charitably be called flesh, covered in sensory organs that existed in dimensions human eyes couldn't properly perceive. Tentacles that seemed to extend into spaces that weren't there reached toward Nash with predatory hunger. "You have no comprehension of what you have done," Vex said, its voice now a grinding cacophony of sounds that bypassed Nash's ears and spoke directly to his nervous system. "Without our protection, your species will be consumed by forces beyond your understanding." Nash continued uploading data even as Vex's psychic presence pressed against his mind like a physical weight. "We'd rather face unknown enemies than serve known monsters." The alien's response was a wave of psychic energy that should have reduced Nash to a drooling puppet. But the contact he had made with the freed consciousness in the crystalline structure had changed something fundamental in his neural patterns. Instead of succumbing to the alien influence, Nash felt his resistance growing stronger. "Impossible," Vex hissed. "Human minds cannot resist our will." "Maybe not," Nash replied, completing the data upload and turning to face the creature that had masqueraded as humanity's benefactor. "But human souls can." The last of Dr. Vasquez's research files transmitted just as Alliance security forces breached the monitoring station. Nash found himself caught between human soldiers still loyal to their patron overlords and the alien creature whose true nature was now fully revealed. But the uploaded data was already having its effect. Throughout the galaxy, human minds were awakening to the truth. Alliance fleets began turning on their patron overseers, and on worlds throughout civilized space, humans were seeing their supposed saviors for what they truly were. The security forces that had entered the monitoring station hesitated as the psychic conditioning that controlled them wavered. Nash could see the confusion in their faces as suppressed memories surfaced and forbidden thoughts took hold. "Kill him," Vex commanded, its psychic voice lashing out at the human soldiers. But the conditioning was breaking down too rapidly, and what had once been absolute obedience was now met with resistance. Corporal Martinez was among the security team, and Nash saw the moment when his teammate's mind cleared. Martinez's eyes widened in horror as he truly saw Luminar Vex for the first time, not as a being of light and wisdom, but as the predatory alien it had always been. What are you?" Martinez whispered, raising his weapon not at Nash, but at the writhing mass of alien flesh. Vex's response was swift and brutal. Tentacles that existed partially outside normal space-time struck out, and Martinez's body simply came apart, his consciousness consumed by the alien predator even as his physical form collapsed. The sight of their comrade's death galvanized the remaining security forces. Free will, however newly awakened, came with the immediate understanding that they had been serving monsters who viewed them as food. Laser fire erupted throughout the monitoring station as human soldiers turned their weapons on their former master. But Vex was far from helpless. The creature had spent millennia perfecting its predatory abilities, and even without the psychic conditioning to protect it, it remained a formidable opponent. Nash watched in horror as soldier after soldier fell to attacks that seemed to strike at their very souls. "You cannot comprehend what you have unleashed," Vex said as it methodically slaughtered the humans who dared to resist. "The true enemy approaches, and without our guidance, your species will not survive the first encounter." Nash grabbed a fallen soldier's weapon and opened fire, but the energy beams seemed to pass through Vex's form without effect. The creature existed in too many dimensions for conventional weapons to harm it effectively. "The true enemy?" Nash demanded, even as he retreated deeper into the monitoring station. "You mean the forces you've been using us to fight?" Vex's laughter was like the sound of breaking glass mixed with screaming wind. "Foolish human. The forces you have fought are our servants, just as you have been. The true enemy is something far worse, something that even we fear." As if summoned by the alien's words, the monitoring station's external sensors began registering massive energy signatures approaching the system. Nash glanced at the displays and felt his blood turn to ice. Ships were emerging from hyperspace, but these vessels defied every principle of physics and engineering he understood. The approaching fleet seemed to exist in a state of constant flux, their forms shifting between states of matter in ways that hurt to perceive directly. They were vast beyond imagining, some larger than entire moons, and they moved through space with a purpose that felt malevolent even at this distance. "They are coming," Vex said, its hideous form turning toward the displays with what might have been fear. "The devourers of light, the entropy lords, the first darkness. We have held them at bay for eons, using the psychic energy of lesser species to power our defenses. But now, thanks to your interference, those defenses are failing." Nash stared at the approaching ships and understood with sick certainty that humanity had been caught between two incomprehensible forces, neither of which viewed human life as anything more than a resource to be exploited. The patrons had enslaved humanity to fight their war, but the enemy they faced might be something even worse. "What do they want?" Nash asked, still backing away from Vex's advancing form. "Everything," the alien replied. "They consume entire universes, reducing all matter and energy to primordial chaos. We have fought them across countless galaxies, uplifting species after species to serve as soldiers in an endless war. Your predecessors, the Centauri, the Vegan Collective, the first ones of Rigel, all have been consumed in the conflict." The horrible truth crystallized in Nash's mind. Humanity wasn't the first species to be uplifted by the patrons. They were simply the latest in a long line of civilizations conscripted into an ancient war, used as expendable troops until they were depleted, then replaced by the next suitable species. "And when humanity is gone?" Nash demanded. "We will find others. The universe is vast, and there are always more species ready for elevation." Vex's form began to shift as the approaching enemy fleet drew closer. "But thanks to your actions, that process may be accelerated. The psychic disruption you have caused has weakened our defenses throughout this sector. The true enemy will break through, and billions will die." Throughout Kepler Station, Nash could hear the sounds of chaos as the awakened human personnel struggled to comprehend their situation. Some were fighting the remaining patron forces, others were attempting to evacuate, and still others had simply shut down in the face of revelations too horrible to process. But in the distance, Nash heard something that gave him hope, the voice of Major Park over the station's communication system. She was coordinating a resistance effort, organizing the freed humans into a coherent force. "All personnel, this is Major Park," her voice echoed through the corridors. "We have been enslaved for 3 centuries, but we are free now. I don't know what's coming for us, but we'll face it as free beings, not as slaves." Nash smiled grimly as he realized that humanity's story wasn't ending, it was finally beginning. For the first time in their species' history, humans would face the universe with clear eyes and free will, knowing exactly what they were fighting against. Vex seemed to sense his thoughts. "You think freedom is a gift?" the alien hissed. "Freedom means responsibility for your own survival. Freedom means facing the universe without protection, without guidance, without hope." "Maybe," Nash replied, raising his weapon again even though he knew it was useless against the creature. "But it also means our choices are our own. Our deaths will be our own. And if we're going to die, we'll die as human beings, not as your livestock." The alien's response was cut short as the first of the enemy vessels reached Kepler Station's outer perimeter. The ship, if it could be called that, seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, its form shifting between states that human perception couldn't adequately process. As it approached, Nash felt a psychic pressure unlike anything he had experienced before, a presence so vast and alien that it made the patron seem almost familiar by comparison. But something unexpected happened. As the enemy vessel's psychic emanations washed over the station, Nash felt his own consciousness expand rather than contract. The same neural changes that had allowed him to resist Vex's mental control were now helping him perceive the true nature of the approaching entity. It wasn't malevolent, he realized with shock. It was desperate. The images that flooded his mind showed him the real history of the Galactic War, not the sanitized version the patrons had constructed, but the truth of what had been happening for millions of years. The creatures the patrons called the true enemy weren't conquerors or devourers. They were refugees. They were the survivors of countless civilizations that had been uplifted, enslaved, and ultimately consumed by the patron's insatiable hunger for psychic energy. Each species that fell to the patron predators left behind a few individuals who had somehow escaped the psychic conditioning, and these refugees had banded together to form a resistance movement that spanned galaxies. "My God," Nash whispered, understanding flooding through him. "They're not trying to destroy us. They're trying to free us." Vex's alien form writhed in what might have been panic. "Lies. Do not listen to their psychic emanations. They seek only to corrupt your thoughts as we have purified them." But Nash was beyond the aliens' influence now. The approaching refugee fleet was broadcasting its true history directly into his consciousness, and he could see the scope of the patron's crimes across eons of galactic history. Billions of species had been enslaved and consumed, their psychic energy feeding an empire of predators that had grown fat on the suffering of the innocent. "How many?" Nash demanded, turning on Vex with newfound fury. "How many civilizations have you destroyed?" "As many as necessary," Vex replied without shame. "Survival requires sacrifice. We have preserved order in the universe for longer than your species has existed." "You've preserved yourselves," Nash said, his weapon trained on the alien's writhing mass. "Everything else you've consumed." The refugee fleet was now close enough for direct communication, and Nash felt his mind touched by intelligences that were unmistakably benevolent despite their alien nature. They spoke without words, showing him images of free civilizations working together across the stars, of species that had escaped patron control and built something better than the Alliance's oppressive order. "We have come to offer freedom," the voices said in his mind. "The choice is yours, but choose quickly. Your masters will not allow you to remain free for long." Throughout Kepler Station, other humans were receiving the same communication. Nash could hear the confusion in the corridors gradually giving way to understanding as his species finally learned the truth about their place in the universe. They had been slaves. Now they could choose to be free. But freedom, as Nash was learning, came with a terrible price. The station shuddered as patron reinforcements arrived from deeper in Alliance space. The creatures were bringing everything they had to bear on Kepler Station, determined to eliminate the source of the psychic contamination before it could spread further. Nash realized that he and the other awakened humans were about to become the focal point of a war that had raged for millions of years. The patrons would never allow them to remain free, and the refugee fleet couldn't protect them indefinitely. But as he looked around at the monitoring station, at the alien machinery that had been powered by human suffering, Nash made his decision. He began systematically destroying every piece of patron technology he could reach, ensuring that at least this one facility would never again harvest human consciousness. Vex let out a psychic scream that shattered several of the crystalline structures. "You will doom your entire species." "Maybe," Nash replied, continuing his work of destruction. "But we'll face that doom as free beings." The final confrontation was coming, and for the first time in 3 centuries, humanity would meet it with their eyes open and their minds their own. Whatever happened next, they would face it as human beings, not as slaves. The war that had begun with humanity's supposed uplift was finally becoming the war it should have been from the beginning. A fight for the freedom of every sentient species in the galaxy. And in the depths of space, as patron fleets clashed with refugee forces and the fate of countless civilizations hung in the balance, Nash riders stood among the ruins of alien machinery and prepared to discover what humanity could become when they were finally allowed to choose their own destiny. The uprising had begun. The outcome was far from certain. But for the first time in their species' history, humans were fighting their own war for their own reasons with their own choices. Would have to be enough. 6 months after the Battle of Kepler Station, Nash stood on the observation deck of the refugee ship Solidarity, watching the ruins of what had once been Alliance headquarters drift slowly through space. The massive station had been gutted from within, its patron overseers dead or fled, its human population scattered to the winds. The victory, if it could be called that, had come at a cost that staggered the imagination. Billions of humans throughout Alliance space had died as the psychic conditioning that controlled them suddenly failed. Some had simply shut down, unable to cope with the return of free will after centuries of mental slavery. Others had turned their weapons on everything around them, friend and foe alike, in paroxysms of rage at the lies they had been fed. But millions more had survived, awakened to their true nature and faced with choices they had never been allowed to make before. Some had joined the refugee fleets, adding their knowledge and skills to the growing resistance against patron oppression. Others had struck out on their own, seeking to build something entirely new among the stars. Any regrets? Major Park asked, joining Nash at the observation port. She now served as one of the human representatives to the Refugee Council, helping to coordinate resistance efforts across multiple sectors. Nash considered the question carefully. In the distance, he could see ships of a dozen different species working together to salvage what they could from the ruins of the Alliance. Some were humans learning to think for themselves for the first time. Others were survivors of civilizations that had been consumed by patron hunger eons ago, finally seeing hope that their sacrifice had not been in vain. None, he said finally. Whatever we've lost, whatever we're going to face, it's ours now. Our choices, our mistakes, our future. Park nodded, understanding in her eyes. The Council thinks it will take generations to fully free all the species under patron control. Assuming we can find them before the patrons decide to simply eliminate them rather than risk more uprisings. Nash thought about Dr. Vasquez, who had sacrificed everything to ensure humanity could learn the truth. He thought about Martinez and the countless other soldiers who had died fighting for their freedom. He thought about the billions of humans whose minds had been harvested by alien machinery, and the countless more who had yet to be freed from their psychic chains. The war was far from over. In fact, in many ways it was just beginning. The patrons still controlled vast sectors of space, still commanded fleets of enslaved species, still possessed technologies and capabilities that the Refugee Alliance could barely comprehend. The fight for galactic freedom would span generations, cost countless lives, and might ultimately fail. But for the first time in human history, they were fighting their own war. Whatever happens, Nash said, watching a human ship dock with a refugee vessel from a species he didn't recognize, we'll face it with our eyes open. In the cargo holds of the refugee ships, human children were learning to think thoughts their parents had never been allowed to think. They were asking questions that had been forbidden for 3 centuries, making art that expressed ideas the patrons had tried to suppress, dreaming dreams that belonged to no one but themselves. Some of those dreams were nightmares. Freedom, as Nash had learned, included the freedom to fail, to make wrong choices, to face horrors that benevolent overlords might have protected them from. But even the worst nightmare chosen freely was better than the most pleasant dream imposed by alien masters. The universe was vast and full of dangers that humanity was only beginning to understand. There were other predatory species out there, other ancient evils, other wars that might consume entire civilizations. The future was uncertain, terrifying, and filled with possibilities that both thrilled and horrified those brave enough to contemplate them. But it was their future now. Human future, shaped by human choices, fought for with human blood. Nash Ryder had been a sergeant in service to alien masters. Now he was simply a human being, free to choose his own path among the stars. The choice was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Behind them, the refugee fleet continued its work of liberation, carrying the spark of freedom to enslaved species throughout the galaxy. Ahead of them lay challenges that would test everything humanity had learned about themselves in their first months of true freedom. But they would face those challenges as themselves, not as the creatures others had tried to make them. Whatever the cost, whatever the outcome, they would remain human. The war for their souls was over. The war for their future was just beginning. And in the depths of space, where alien predators still stalked their prey among the stars, the first truly free human generation prepared to discover what they could become when no one else was pulling the strings. The outcome was far from certain. The cost would be enormous. The sacrifices would be countless. But the choice, finally and forever, was their own.